Why would anyone leave everything that they've ever known, friends, family, home, for a country that is halfway around the world? That's a question that I've been grappling with ever since I first set foot onto Deerfield Academy's campus. Now, this question resonates with me not out of mere curiosity, but from a deep personal connection. On my very first night away from home, I found myself asking myself this exact same question. Why on earth would I leave behind home-cooked meals and no curfew for mandatory study hall and a roommate who snores all the time? Deep down, I think I knew the answer to this question. It's the same thing that has motivated me and my fellow internationals, as well as generations of other people, to uproot their lives and cross oceans. Opportunity. While much of the discussion surrounding the migration debate centers around the countries that people ultimately migrate to, or their reasons for migrating in the first place, I believe that there is a third, often underrepresented aspect of the migration debate, the countries that people migrate from in the first place, that often goes understated. When you observe this phenomenon known as brain drain, if you look at its effects, it ultimately has the potential to stall economic development in developing countries and further entrench already existing global wealth disparities. But what exactly is brain drain, and how does it affect the countries that experience it? Well, the United Nations Development Fund, an index, currently describes brain drain as the flight of highly skilled human capital from developing countries to developed countries. In other words, brain drain takes place when highly skilled or educated individuals leave their home country in search for better opportunities elsewhere. Importantly, brain drain differs from general migration in two key ways. Firstly, brain drain specifically involves the migration of highly skilled or educated people in a certain profession. People like doctors, lawyers, engineers, and other skilled professionals who need specialized training that is often crucial to their home country's economic development. Unlike general migration, which encompasses of people of varying educational levels, brain drain specifically involves the movement of those who are specialized in whatever field it is that they are doing. Second, and most important, brain drain is the unilateral movement of people who are highly skilled from developing nations to developed nations. Now, there are a number of reasons why someone living in a developing country would want to move to a developed country. The World Economic Forum cites a few, those being that people are motivated by the prospect of having better jobs, better economic opportunities in a more developed country, and improved access to both housing and healthcare. Ultimately, in terms of negative factors for why people would migrate from their country might be afflicted with political instability or other kinds of political strife that would cause people to leave. Speaking from personal experience as an international student, studying in wealthier countries offers a medley of incentives that would cause people to leave. Unlike my home country of South Africa, for example, here in the United States, you can generally expect the government to provide basic necessities like food or water for more than a third of the day. When it comes to other incentives for why immigrants would look to study abroad in the first place, there are more benefits than I mentioned. One of the main ones being that your educators tend to be more qualified, you have better access to resources, and the educational infrastructure is also better in the first place. To give you an example, if I were to pursue my desired career field of becoming a software engineer in South Africa, I could expect to make roughly 400,000 Rand, which translates to 21,000 US dollars. This may not seem like much, but in South Africa, it is actually in the higher echelon of earnings. But if I were to pursue a job in software engineering in the United States, on the other hand, I could expect to make upwards of 5 times that amount, over $100,000 every year. With this in mind, it becomes a little easier to understand why so many talented people would be motivated to leave their birthplace in search for more prosperous economic opportunities in the long run. So, at this point, you may find yourself asking, why does this matter? People migrate all the time, so what makes brain drain particularly harmful? To answer this question, we need to look into the age-old debate about why certain countries are wealthier than others. Amongst other factors, economists generally cite disparities in educational levels between developing and developed countries for why certain countries hold more wealth to this day. For decades, organizations like the International Monetary Fund, UNESCO, and the World Bank have cited education as a means for impoverished countries to pull themselves up. But in the words of William J. Carrington, also of the International Monetary Fund, one of the most important implications of brain drain is that it means that investment into education in developing countries won't necessarily translate to higher economic output in the future. If a country is losing a large number of its most skilled and educated people to migration every year, this will ultimately lead to massive skill shortages in that main country. When it comes to offsetting the incentives provided by wealthier nations, it's in the best interest of developing nations to prioritize their talent and understand why people emigrate in the first place. Brain drain ultimately throws developing countries into some kind of death spiral where they lack the economic output to educate their population. But then they also lack the educational infrastructure to ultimately build up a skilled and prosperous working sector. This makes it difficult to retain educated people in the long run once again. In fact, a study by Jeans Manuel Krogstad and Jane Radford reveals that the number of US migrants who are highly educated has steadily been on the rise. In 1960, right around 5% of people migrating to the United States had a bachelor's degree. But in the year 2000, that number increased to over 24%. The most recent statistics that I could find, dated to 2016, state that right around 30% of migrants have a bachelor's degree or higher. With this in mind, it becomes obvious that the United States is currently prioritizing highly skilled and educated migrants in their migration policies. This sentiment has also been echoed by numerous governmental officials who reaffirmed their support for the United States H-1B visa program, which prioritizes highly skilled and talented individuals from overseas. Given that non-US citizens currently receive over half of doctoral degrees issued in the United States, it becomes important to see how key migration has been both to our workforce and the field of academia as a whole. While on the micro level, it may be difficult to observe the effects of brain drain due to the sheer scale of the economies that we are dealing with. In smaller developing countries like Micronesia, they are actually small enough for us to observe its effects in full. In 2022, Samoa was one of the most impacted nations, according to the Brain Drain Indicator score, receiving a score of around 10. This score was issued by the Fragile States Index, and it measures the stability of countries. This score takes into account political instability, economic output, and their ability to maintain skilled professionals, with a higher score indicating a higher vulnerability to the effects of brain drain and human capital loss. A study by Michael Bain of Oxford University revealed that in smaller developing nations like Samoa, emigration rates of skilled professionals can reach as high as 50%. The emigration of half of your skilled workforce, generally considered the most productive members of your workforce, is ultimately indicative of how severe brain drain has become as a problem, especially in smaller developing countries. Fortunately, in some larger developing countries, like my home country of South Africa, the rates of immigration due to brain drain are far lower, sitting at around 10%. But the most interesting finding of Bain and colleagues in their Oxford study was that there is another effect that works counter to brain drain, known as brain gain. This study estimates that while 60% of developing countries experienced a net loss in human capital due to brain drain, there was a smaller number, yes, but 40% of those developing countries did actually see a net gain in human capital. This means that in certain countries, despite the emigration of a large number of their highly skilled workers, the amount of human capital they have after which is ultimately higher than it was in the first place. At first, this idea may seem counterintuitive. How does the loss of a country's skilled professionals lead to a more educated and productive workforce in the long run? Well, when you examine it at a further scale, it becomes obvious why this happens. This mainly occurs because people in developing countries are encouraged to pursue higher education, which leads them to study harder in school and generally pursue more advanced degrees like doctorates or master's degrees. And they are motivated by the prospect of studying in a wealthier, more developed nation. Even though they have the intention of leaving their country, using this education to ultimately emigrate, the fact that they still pursued that higher education is impacting their workforce and making it more educated. Another important factor is the fact that not everyone who pursues higher education with the intent to emigrate from their home country is actually successful. This could be for a number of reasons, namely visa issues, international job security problems, and inability to afford the cost of living in a more developed country. But in the end, what's important is that when someone pursues education in order to leave their home country, the labor force in their home country becomes much stronger in the event that they do not actually leave. In nations like India and like China, where their schools can keep up with the rising educational demand caused by increasing emigration rates, the incentives to pursue higher education may actually outweigh the losses of human capital that they experience from emigration. However, in most African countries and most Central American countries, emigration rates are too high and educational infrastructure is too low, meaning that the steady outflow of talented and skilled workers ultimately hurts them in the long run, hindering their economic development and stagnating their economy as a whole. Ultimately, out of the 127 developing countries surveyed in Bain's and colleagues' study, a little over half of them were hurt by brain drain, whereas the other half benefited from brain gain. When it comes to brain drain, more countries emerge as losers than winners. However, when aggregated, as a whole, the general collective of people are left more educated, and countries tend to see a net gain in human capital. So, what about those aforementioned losers of the brain drain race? What happens to countries like Zimbabwe, like the Dominican Republic, and like Sri Lanka? Countries with high rates of immigration and poor educational infrastructure. I would argue that countries in this predicament should adopt a similar model to that of Taiwan. The journey of Morris Chang, who founded the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company after receiving his education in the United States, exemplifies how strategic policy implementation can transform brain drain into brain circulation. By creating an environment that incentivizes the return of skilled professionals, Taiwan not only was able to reclaim much of the talent that it lost to US educational institutions, but they were able to become the global leader in the semiconductor industry. Similarly, countries like India and countries like China have harnessed the benefits of brain circulation by providing incentives to contribute to their home country through remittance packages or knowledge transfer laws. As someone who has benefited from an education far from their home country, I carry with me the paradox of brain drain. I know exactly why people leave, but I also know why they look back. When it comes to governmental legislation, these things are important, but ultimately, whether your country is left drained or gained by your departure is up to you. So, when someone like Morris Chang comes back to Taiwan from the United States, not only does he bring with him his expertise in semiconductor manufacturing, he also brings with him tax dollars to fund Taiwanese education. When looking at it on this basis, it becomes clear that if governments can create incentives that encourage skilled professionals to return, while also maintaining personal and individual benefits for those returners, in doing so, maybe, just maybe, we can turn brain drain into brain circulation and see bigger benefits for both home and host countries. Thank you.